also want to thank you and all the organizers of the conference for pulling together this particular panel on this topic of trying to tie in the moral dimension of leadership in crisis and the dimension of character, which I think most of you have probably noticed from the very first speaker that we had, Mr. Bill George, yesterday morning through Admiral Houck, our last speaker, has been kind of a theme that's been woven throughout the comments. You can't really talk about leadership in general and leadership in crisis in particular without touching upon the issue of character and morals and ethics in the decision-making process, I suppose, through all this. So what we have as kind of set up here for you this afternoon is a series of true experts from a broad variety of fields. We've got experts in practice from the military, from the private sector, the business world, from medicine and the spiritual sector as well. And they're all going to offer you, I think, their insights to how decisions are made in spite of difficult circumstances. Mr. George again started off with the point that it's fairly easy in a sterile environment such as a classroom to make tough decisions because you really don't have any skin in the game, as they say. There's nothing really at stake. But in the laboratory of practice, from which our four expert panelists are drawn, those decisions become infinitely more complex. So I'm going to actually go in the order to get their perspectives that it is published in your brochure for today. I'm going to start with Mr. Jeff Neufeld, who is on your right, on my left, and we'll kind of go right down the line through Dr. Beading, Chaplain Wallingford, and then finally Colonel Constantini. So without any further ado, sir.
Thank you, Joe. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon and to join this conference. My journey into leadership began some 34 plus years ago, right here at this institution. And I spent 10 years as a Marine officer before going into private industry. And in the last 20 plus years, I've had the absolute fun to be in numerous industries and companies, including companies like GE, Lockheed Martin, Citibank, and most recently Fidelity Investments. And I've had a chance to do electronics and human resources, large-scale information systems, and finally into finance, mutual funds, and the brokerage business. So first of all, I'd like to congratulate all of you for having chosen to pursue the vocation of leadership. And I assume that's why you're all here. And whether you're starting out on your military career or a private industry career or a public service career, I think it's very important to recognize and note that you have chosen to be leaders. And that's a big deal. It's a very big deal. It's a very big decision. And what comes with that is a commitment to be the best leader that you possibly can. And I want to share two pieces of advice that I had very early on, one from my military and one 10 years later in the civilian world. When I went down to Quantico, one of the basic things I learned very early on as a second lieutenant was take care of your troops, they'll take care of the mission, and they'll take care of you. Kept that very close for many years. And interestingly, 10 years later, I was up in Crotonville with GE. Jack Welch was speaking. I was a new first-line manager, totally in awe of the man sitting up there on the stage talking to us. And he says, if I can have you remember one thing about my talk tonight, remember this. The best thing you can do to make yourself a good leader is never lose sight of the fact that the people you lead are your number one customer. That leadership is a product, it's a service, and you provide it to the people that you get the privilege to lead. Now, there's a whole lot of dimensions to leadership, but today we're talking about the very specific one, how do you maintain your character and your values in times of crisis? Very tough decision. And we've heard much about crises in the last 2 days from the panels. I had the fortune of listening to the other great panels. Amazing people faced huge crises, very accomplished, and they handled them. But you also heard several people say that crises don't have to be huge. Crises can be small as well, and that's exactly what I want to focus on, is that smaller crises. Because the larger crises are something that comes later in life. And it's easy to think about Cuban Missile Crisis and other things that don't apply to you. But what I want to focus on is in the context of your own personal development as leaders. and I would like to give you a different definition of a crisis. Crisis is any tough decision you have to make in the coming few years. And not just any tough decision. The one that makes your palms sweat. The one that makes your heart pound and you start to get the roaring in your ears because you're not sure what the right answer is. And it has consequences. What you do has consequences. Those are not so uncommon. And in fact, I imagine that every one of you in this room have already experienced those kinds of crises in your life. But here's the critical thing. In the next 1 or 2 years, the stakes are going to go up dramatically because you're going to go out there and start to assume leadership roles at whatever level, and the consequences will really matter at that point. So just to dive into a little flavor of what I'm talking about, here's a couple of scenarios from real life. I won't use Marine stories because those go back way too far for me. A couple of civilian stories, just to give you the flavor. You walk into a meeting with your boss, big staff meeting. She looks right at you and she says, "I don't think your financial numbers and budgets are hitting it. What are you doing about it?" You assure her you've got it covered, you'll have it recovered by the end of the year, no problem. She's not so sure. She says, "I think we need bolder action now. I want you to lay off 20% of your people to make your numbers." Well, do you agree? Or do you risk your bonus and maybe your job? Maybe you're giving a tough performance review. I mean, tough like no raise, no promotion, and I don't know if you're going to be working here in a while. And the person says, "You know what? I'm going to sue you and I'm going to sue the company." What do? Back off your review? Or maybe your company was just acquired. New management, new culture, new mission. Everything's up in the air, but you're good, and they want you to stay. They offer you a promotion and money. But you have heard that the way they treat their employees, their suppliers, their customers, it's not the way you do it. Not so sure. But you know if you stay, you got to carry out the plan. So what are you going to tell them? So that brings us back to the hard question. How do you maintain your character and values when you have to make a tough decision in a stressful situation? Or let me put it another way. How do you prepare yourselves to do what you hope you would do when the time comes? Well, in my experience, it's something you have to work at. There's no easy answers, and it's not something you're born with. Certainly we get things from our upbringing, from our family, our parents, our faith, our experiences, the culture we live in. But that's more about the what of the ethic and value you have. It's not about the how do you stay true to those values. So I can offer up 3 pieces of guidance along that as you are preparing yourself and going forward. First of all, decide where character and integrity fits in your life. Be very conscious. Think about your values. Think about what's important to you and where you're going to draw your lines. You need to know that before the pounding in your ears starts and the palms start sweating. The second thing is, spend some time thinking about the situations you might be in your job before they happen. Run it through your head. Play out the scenarios. Who might say what? What would you do? All the scenarios I gave you are real life, by the way. And all those scenarios could have been anticipated. You want to think about those to the degree you can ahead of time before they happen. And finally, test your values when you make the decisions. After the fact, go back and be a critical assessor of yourself. How did my values stack up? What I believe in, did I hold to it? Do I need to adjust what I believe in? Am I as confident as I was when I went into that situation? What did I learn? What mistakes did I make? And you will make the mistakes. Don't worry about that. You've heard that over and over again. And take that learning so that when you come out of that decision, you can say, how did I feel about how I did? Did I feel good? Do I feel good about what I just did? And use that as your test as you come out of that. So take every opportunity to learn from your crises, to the theme of the conference. And if you can learn from them, be a critical evaluator of yourself, test and strengthen those values as you go on, I think you'll have the confidence that you'll be ready when the big crisis hits, and you'll be able to do what you hoped you would do when it does.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Neufeld. Dr. Beading.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to be here today at this fine institution. What's not in the biography there is that actually this is where I was supposed to go to school. I grew up on a boat. I taught for the U.S. Power Squadrons. Had an appointment here. But then they said my eyes were too bad and I wasn't fit for naval service, so they didn't accept me. Next year I went to the Air Force Academy, got in no problem. They told me I'd never fly. I said, that's fine, I want to go to medical school. But before I graduated, they decided they wanted me to fly, so I did. I had 5 years actually out doing air refueling as a navigator before finally getting to go back to medical school. And that little deviation from my career, for those of you who are going into military service especially, I'd say don't be afraid of something that's other than what you had anticipated for your career path, because the deviations can be the richest fertilization for your experiences that you could imagine. But I did go back to medical school, got the opportunity to go to the DoD medical school, so I'm a total educated product of the government. And other than the small scar on my forehead, you can't really tell. I had a great career as an Air Force flight surgeon and family physician, assignments overseas, deployments, doing operational jobs, clinical jobs, leadership jobs. I had about 8 years of command total as squadron group, deputy group commander, and really, really enjoyed the combination of those two roles. Until I retired, 1st of March 2009, I had an opportunity as senior faculty at the medical school in Bethesda, Uniformed Services University, to greet many of the applicants who were coming in to talk about what they were signing up for, if you will, as a career in military medicine. And I would point out that there were two professions. And profession is a very powerful word to me. The profession of arms and the profession of medicine. And that it was a double responsibility that they were committing to by saying they were going to join those professions. It means a lot of things, and we talk about our core values in all the services, service before self, et cetera, and that they needed to pay attention to the words, think about what it meant to them, and make sure that agreeing to join those professions was what they really were willing to do. Or they should find some other course of action other than certainly going to a military school or probably going to medicine at all. And I would say that, as it links to this, that's one of the strongest, tools in the toolbox that we have in medicine and in military medicine is that profession. The professional values and history and tradition and the culture that takes a while to absorb. I didn't have that culture when I left after only 4 years at the Air Force Academy. It wasn't that slow. But I had a good start. I had the seeds were planted, certainly. And as I grew experience in the service and I learned to operate jointly with brothers and sisters in the other military services, I truly gained an appreciation of what that military profession of arms culture was. And I would say that has helped me in times of serious deliberation and decisions. And the medical culture is one too. Looking specifically at the areas where these critical dilemmas, if you will, and moral decision-making come to the forefront. Obviously, when you're dealing with patient health care, what you say to whom. You have a female patient that has breast cancer and she doesn't want you to tell her husband. That's a dilemma as a physician because you understand the strength, the support of the network that's involved with the family, the spouse, et cetera. But you have to respect that individual's choice and autonomy in making that decision. I wouldn't say that was a crisis dilemma, though. But a couple of instances, one has been alluded to in your prior discussions, detainees. Our military has gone through a very tumultuous period over the last several years, the last 8 years or so, when it comes to detainee care. When I was going through my law of armed conflict training as a cadet, and as I was going through similar training in Geneva Conventions as a medical student and as a resident, it was pretty clear cut and dried. But then the practice, that laboratory of practice, was a little bit different over the last 5 or 6 years. And if you've read the news, if you're not aware of that, we did some things with detainees, as Admiral Houck alluded to, that we probably shouldn't have done. But it was the decision of senior leadership, and some medical people were put into positions of playing roles other than caregivers, of gathering intelligence, of providing advice to interrogators as to what the medical condition of the detainee was that might be exploited against them. Dietary adjustment for a diabetic patient, say, or how much fatigue or how much physical stress or emotional stress could a detainee take before they collapsed. Those are realms that are by law outside of our capacity as military physicians, but some members of our profession were put into positions where they had to walk that line and make those decisions, and some of us made decisions that they probably regret now. But the main area that I would like to talk about, because it applies not only in the military settings, but across the civilian settings in medicine, is standards of care. Now, we have a standard of care across medical communities, military and civilian, of treating the most seriously injured individual or most seriously ill person first. If you go into an emergency room, whether it be in a military hospital or a civilian hospital, and you have a laceration or a cut on your hand and it needs to be sewn up, and there's somebody next to you with an asthma attack, breathing problem, or chest pain, possible heart attack, they're going to be taken care of first. You're going to be triaged or sorted, delayed to wait till the other person gets treated. And that's how we're conditioned and taught within the profession of medicine. In military medicine, from early on, we are also taught another paradigm, and that's battlefield triage, sometimes referred to in the civilian community as reverse triage. And in that situation, the most seriously injured patients may be the ones that you do nothing for, possibly providing comfort care. And the rationale behind it is that our job in that situation is to do the most good for the most people. So if you have 25 casualties and two of them are very seriously injured, they would take all of your attention and all of your resources, and possibly 5 or 6 of the other moderately injured casualties might die. Then you're supposed to focus on that 5 or 6 and leave the other 2, we call the category expected to die. If they are still alive at the time that you stabilize your other patients, you can go back and reevaluate them, reassess them, and treat them if possible. It's a dynamic situation. But for many people who have never been trained in that paradigm, it is totally foreign, and they have a difficulty grasping it. Well, especially since 2005 and the problems that we had in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, this issue of altered standards of care in disaster situations has become much more in the awareness, the conscious awareness across the civilian medical community. In fact, the American Medical Association has held some meetings to discuss this. Several state legislatures, especially Louisiana, has looked at the issue and changed some of the laws, because at issue here are not just the ethical issues of, do I really let somebody die, but they come to the point of, all right, now I have these patients who I don't have the resources to take care of. Do I take the next step, because it can be a slippery slope? Do I maybe give them a little bit extra medication and assist them in slipping over the edge into a peaceful, restful death? Now, there's a word for that. We call it euthanasia. It's illegal. It's considered against the morals of the medical profession. But when you're in a situation where you have people who are suffering and there is no way to provide real aid and comfort to them, that is a situation that can be very difficult for either a military or a civilian medical person, whether they're a physician or a nurse, to make and live with. Of course, there's the liability issues in that situation, because the family members of those who die in those situations can come back and bring liability issues, lawsuit issues, et cetera, which can affect not only the financial wealth, but the mental health of the people who are involved. So this issue of altered standards of care in critical situations, we were faced with it again most recently, actually, in a conceptual way, when the President declared a potential public health national emergency for H1N1 virus. Well, we didn't really have a lot of people dropping dead all over the country like some people almost predicted, but the potential is there. The potential is there for some other infectious disease, whether it be a natural form of Ebola that becomes communicable from person to person, or an intentional man-made bioterrorism weapon that gets spread from person to person, where we are confronted with a situation where we cannot take care of all of the ill or injured people, and how do we deal with that as a medical profession? And that's the kind of critical decision-making that we've got to be prepared for, as you said, by thinking through it ahead of time, by identifying what your core values are going to be, and where on your scale of priorities you're going to put that moral spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beading. Chaplain Wallingford.
Thank you, sir. I want to thank you for allowing me to come. I am one of the chaplains here. There are 8 chaplains here at the Naval Academy, and I'm one of them. I have been in the Navy for 13 years. I've been a chaplain for 7 years. I spent time, as you can read in my bio, as a missionary in Japan. In a crisis situation or under stress, one thing that's clear is that it's really easy to make very bad decisions. And it's kind of interesting that this is the topic today, because as I was driving to work, I heard on the radio there was a psychological experiment that was done with people who were given numbers to memorize, and then they had to walk down the hallway and go into another room and repeat those numbers. And one person was given 2 numbers to memorize, and the other person was given 7 numbers to memorize. And as they walked down the hallway, somebody met them and talked with them about they had fruit or they could have chocolate cake. So it basically distracted them before they got into the room. And what they found was that the person who had to memorize the 2 numbers, when he or she got to the room, chose the fruit. But the person who had to memorize the 7 numbers, when he or she got to the room, almost always chose the chocolate cake. I mean, it was overwhelming, the results. And what they determined is when our minds are busy, in other words, when we're under stress, when we're trying to memorize 7 numbers, if you will, our rational mind is so engaged with that it's hard to make good choices in anything else. So we can apply that to what we're talking about today. When we are under stress and our minds are engaged in what we're trying to solve or whatever issue is going on, it's very hard to make moral decisions, to make rational moral decisions, decisions we would make if everything were a sterile environment and we could simply choose, but it didn't really affect us, like we do when we're in the classroom and we're just solving some sort of a scenario. Sadly, for me as a chaplain, I end up talking to people on the other end of a bad decision, on the other end of an immoral decision. This past couple of years, I was deployed on the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and sadly, I have to say that there are a number of cases that are very similar to the one I'm going to talk to you about now. A sailor came in my office, and he was crying. Very, very big, muscular man, bawling. So we sat down and talked, and I ended up speaking with him over weeks for several hours. Come to find out, he had committed adultery on the ship with one of our sailors. Married, loved his wife, had grown up with her in high school and knew her, adorable 2-year-old son. Never in his wildest dreams had he thought that that's what he would end up doing. He was paying severe relationship consequences, obviously, for his decision, but also, because he's in the military and adultery is against the UCMJ, career consequences he was paying. So I spent a lot of time with him just talking about what were the things that led up to him making this type of decision. What kinds of things could he put in place so that the next time he's presented with some sort of an immoral decision, he chooses the right path and the path he would normally choose if he were not under stress. I don't know how many of you have ever been to sea, but it can be a stressful environment. You know, you're away from your family, you're working 12, 15-hour days. So, under stress, it's really, really easy to make immoral decisions. In the Navy, we have something we call ORM, Operational Risk Management. And the point of that is to do what we can do to make sure that we increase the probability of a successful mission. And I think for us personally in our lives, we can engage in what I call moral risk management. Make decisions and arrange things in our lives so that we increase the probability of moral success in our lives. And my suggestions about this would be, first I would say, and it has been said before, we need to decide individually, we need to decide what our moral standards are going to be. Some of you were raised in a religious environment, and that would probably provide some form of a standard for you, but even if you weren't, choose what your moral standards are going to be. And then have the courage to accept the consequences of those standards. It might mean that you have to say no to some things that everybody else is doing. You know what? I'm going to say no. I've got these standards and I'm going to hold up to them, because you know that those things will lead you down a path you don't want to go. Another thing that was mentioned before, build if-then scenarios and run them through your mind. If this happens, then I'm going to do this. I have a friend who deployed to the Philippines. Unfortunately, it's very easy to commit moral sin in the Philippines, or at least it was at the time when he talked to me, and he was very candid about what had gone on. But what he decided is he had a friend, and he and his friend held each other accountable, and whenever they would go off the ship, they would be together, and they would hold each other accountable, and they had earned the right to call each other on the carpet about it. And that would be my next point, is to build authentic relationships with people and accountability. So when you're in a situation, the person next to you is a good enough and a close enough person that he or she can say, I don't think you want to go have that drink with her. Remember your wife and the kids and whatever it is. And guys, I'm not trying to pick on you. Girls, you can pick someone and she might be able to say to you, look, I don't think you want to go off with that guy. You know, remember Joe back home? And obviously I'm just picking on this particular issue, but I have to say on the ship it was rampant. Really. So, building a network of people who are close enough to us, and it's a mutual thing where we have the ability to call them on the carpet and hold them accountable, and vice versa. And the last thing I would say would be to find and learn from moral mentors that you admire. Whose life out there is it that you're like, man, I love the way he or she puts his life together? Find those people, ask them to mentor you. Thanks.
All right, Chaplain, thanks very much. Colonel Constantini.
Thanks for inviting me here. If you read my bio, you realize I graduated from here in 1985. I think we got class of 2010 out there, so that makes me old. I'll just say that I'm going to go have dinner tonight with my sponsor, class of 47.
Wow.
So I'm actually quite young. My background is I'm a career infantry officer. I've done some strange things in the Marine Corps. I'm going to be talking in a military context to the military people here. I think that for the civilians here, there's some relevance in that, and perhaps hopefully get a little window into how we think about doing business. Primarily, I want to talk a little bit about the combat environment. In the combat environment, as opposed to a training environment, which is where we are now, or a peacetime operational environment, which is what a lot of my time in the military was. Better than 23 years of it in peacetime operational type of environment. The first thing I'll tell you is there's no switch. You're not going to get to that environment and say, I'm going to do things differently, because it's a combat environment. You do actually fight like you train. You play like you practice. And so I think that's the number one lesson is that you've got to establish how you're going to do business and how you're going to make decisions. The combat environment can be of a much different intensity. In some ways, a huge intensity difference from the peacetime operational environment at both extremes. Because a combat environment can have obviously moments of huge stress, fear, anxiety, but also incredible boredom with nothing to do, which you actually rarely find in a peacetime operational environment. And both of those extremes can lead to crisis. The cost of failure in a combat environment is off the charts, catastrophic. In theory, the defense of the nation, although for people of our low level, it's probably not going to come to that. But for a Marine's family, the potential price is catastrophic. You form a lifelong relationship with someone when you hand them the flag that was on the coffin of their son. You want to make sure that all the decisions that led up to him being in that box, that you will be happy to review. And circumstances happen. Marines end up dead. Some of them, though, not necessarily because of proper choices. And I'm not saying you're not going to make mistakes. People made mistakes. I made mistakes. There's gravestones over some of those mistakes. But are they moral and ethical things that you should have done better, or you knew in advance and you didn't do? You don't want that lifelong relationship. In that environment, there's a huge number of conflicts. And I got to say, I enjoyed the lawyer, the Admiral Haug, talking about follow the rules. It's impossible. The rules are in conflict. The rules are in conflict. That's why we pay you to be in charge. And I'm not saying interpret the rules, but at some point, the rule says you've got to do this, and that rule says you've got to do that, and that leads to risk. You've got to assess that risk and determine, is that reasonable or not? Am I going to cross some sort of ethical, moral boundary by assuming this risk? Is that within my span of control and authority? Is that proper to do? That's the dilemma you'll face. You'll have potential crisis on what your CO wants you to do and what you want to do. This idea of mission versus troop welfare. You will accomplish your mission. You will accomplish your mission. At what price to your troop welfare? What risk are you willing to assume to accomplish that mission? And if that's an undue risk, what are you willing to tell your boss? And that potentially is a crisis for some. I'll give you a couple things, and then I want to hopefully talk some Q&A. This business is not about you. If you're about you, you're in the wrong business, because it's not about you. It's about us. And a lot of people put themselves in jeopardy because they make it a business about me. And then the consequence is to me. So therefore, I don't do that. Normally, you've just made a bad decision. I'll give you one thing. We have this idea, set the example. I think it's very, very powerful. If you are willing to set the example, you'll get to the environment and you're going to have to make the decision. And you know that by setting the example, this is what your subordinates are going to do and follow and think is right. And you determine, what example do I want to set? It's very hard to make a bad decision when you've constantly been in that environment and thought through that lens. And then I'll leave you, I'll show you how we can be in conflict. Please don't raise your hand, just shout out. Where do we teach you to lead from? The physical location. From the front. That's answer number one. Where else? The point of friction, or perhaps where we can best control the unit. So I was a light armored reconnaissance battalion commander. In light armored reconnaissance, we ride in a 14-ton light armored vehicle. The best place to control your platoon is from inside your vehicle. You got a gun, you got a sight, 14.5 power, you got 2 radios, you're on an integrated communication system. You can control everything from there. when we would come up to danger points, and particularly where we'd be crossing bridges, the enemy liked to set up mines and IEDs here. So we would typically approach them differently every time. And one of the ways we'd approach it is dismount a patrol, go by foot, inspect the ground up, and then drive the vehicles up. Imagine yourself being surrounded by 14.5 tons of steel or by 15 pounds of Kevlar. It's much safer, trust me, to be in the turret of your LAV than it is to be in the front of your unit on that counter IED patrol. Where do you lead from? Well, you lead from the front, and where you can best control your unit. And if you lead from the front, you dismount and walk up to the bridge. You really can't control your unit because an old fat bald guy like me will call you on your radio and you're not near your radio. And then I'm going to yell at you. And if you lead from your turret, all those young Marines that we lead from the front and we're bold, initiative leaders, they see you sitting in your turret all the time. Where do you lead from? We told you to follow the rules. Lead from the front. Lead where you can best control your unit. Follow the rules. Does anyone have a little sense of dilemma? And that's what it is to be a military leader.
All right, thanks, Colonel Constantini. And thanks to all the panelists. As we have with the last three, we've got microphones positioned in the front of the auditorium on either side. If you've got questions for our panelists, if you'll make your way to the microphone, and I'll kind of go back and forth as the questions arise. If you've got someone in particular that you would like to address your question, I just ask that you'd specify that. Otherwise, we'll just kind of pick and choose as they come. All right? Sir, start with you.
It's not on yet. Is it on? Yeah, it's on now. Okay. My name's Grant Mellon from the University of Pennsylvania. My question is actually directed to Mr. Neufeld. Coming from a military background and then into the business world, did you find that, I guess I have to relate this back to the topic of ethics, but did you find that what you learned early on with your military background helped you in terms of making decisions within the business world and leading the different organizations you had? Again, I could relate this to what the colonel said in his last, when he spoke about, the military institution being, if this is about you, you're in the wrong place. Whereas in the business world, it seems more or less that it really is, if it's not about you there, then you're almost in the wrong place. Just to talk on that a little bit. Thank you very much.
No, it's a great question. Thank you. What I found was that you can go a long way towards keeping your true north and holding to your values by being very careful about who you work for. So companies and cultures are different out there. So you want to be careful about that choice. The second thing I would say is absolutely I found that what I learned here at the Academy about basics of leadership, and it was before that, as the chaplain said, it goes back to your upbringing, your family, your values. Being a young officer in the Marine Corps, going to my first assignment, have 45, 50 people look at you, and suddenly you're in command, and several weeks before I was sitting out in one of these seats with a first-class uniform on. I'm 22 years old. They're all about my age or younger, and a couple that could have been my father, and suddenly I'm supposed to be leading. So you learn a lot there, and you make a lot of mistakes in a hurry. And what I found when I got to the civilian world, surprisingly, was the lack of the basics that you're already talking about in your breakout groups. A huge lack of it. So I would encourage you, whether you're in the service, plan on public service, or going into private industry, this stuff works everywhere. And don't let anyone tell you that it doesn't.
Thanks, very good. All right, this side.
Allie Bentley from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm just curious what each of you actually, if you have a thought, think that like individual psychological tendencies have to do with ethical behavior. For example, the Stanley Milgram experiments, guy pressing the button, man screaming on the other side, and yet they continue to press person after person after person. I'm curious, do you think that those internal tendencies that we have just as human beings, and perhaps the doctor might know a little bit more about that, but do you think that that can really fight a person to act ethically in a situation where they might normally act differently?
Okay, a question of human nature. Dr. Beading, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think, thank you. That very intriguing perspective to take on it. Is there a genetic code for integrity or for morals? I don't think so. The Milgram experiments, for anybody who is not familiar with those, go out and I'm sure if you Google and you go on YouTube, you can probably find some incredible videos about it. But it demonstrated that many individuals would inflict significant pain on other people, and the biggest factor was they had the power to do so, and they were given some encouragement to do so, et cetera. But it really showed a lack of humanity, fairly shallow underneath a veneer of civilization and humanity, I think. Was at least a lot of the interpretation from that. I think that one of the problems is probably societal and cultural, how much we look beyond ourselves as what the framework, what the value system is. And I think you might find different. What I have never seen is that experiment repeated, for one thing. It's largely used as a bad example of research by most institutional review boards that have to approve research. But it would be interesting to look at cultural differences in that, I think, if it was done in a way that could be approved. And let me point out that the individuals were not actually had pain inflicted on them. They weren't shocked. They were just reacting as if so. They heard the screams from the other side. It wasn't like they were really electrocuting each other. But I don't think that there's really any kind of a biological difference or a psychological difference between people in that. It's kind of what you internalize, and a lot of that is unconscious. It's you know how you were brought up, what was role modeled for you growing up, but a lot of it we choose ourselves. We see good and bad examples around us every single day. And if we choose the bad examples to follow, we can't really blame the bad examples. That was our choice. And I think probably one of the biggest risks we have is abrogating that responsibility for the choices that we make.
Chaplain, would you like to weigh on this since it's a question of human nature?
Sure.
I suppose there's a philosophical, theological aspect to it too.
Sure, just a little bit. Couple things. One thing, personality-wise, I'm sure you're familiar with Myers-Briggs personality type indicator. We all come at things from different perspectives. But I think over and above that, or maybe even in conjunction with that, our own emotional baggage, whatever that is. And I'm of the opinion that pretty much everybody has some emotional baggage somewhere. The question is, how much of it have we recognized is there, and how much of it have we worked through? And I think for us, when we don't work through our emotional baggage, then it's easy at times for people to be able to push our buttons, trigger things. And if we haven't been in an environment where there's anyone like that for a while, and then we run into someone maybe in a new workspace that, dang, every time he says that, I just want to, what is going on there? And I think we owe it to ourselves to make sure that we figure out, what baggage do I carry? And understand, number one, it's not a disease to have emotional baggage, it's actually human. And number two, what is that baggage? Number three, begin to work through it so that we can normalize our reactions to it and come to reactions to it that are, if you will, socially acceptable and right. In other words, every time someone says a particular word to me, maybe when I was a kid, I got knocked in the face. So then, 10 years after leaving home, I go into an environment, and it's the first time I've heard that word, and I knock them in the face or expect them to do that to me. I think us working through our own baggage helps us not react with triggers. And I don't know, but I would wonder about that experiment, and you could, I guess, inform on this, how much of that and how much of their thought process was related to stuff they just hadn't worked through from before.
I would say one thing is a commander, battalion commander, we had about 6 maneuver elements at one point, 1,400 subordinates spread over an area the size of the state of West Virginia. The personality type that I feared dramatically was a person who unwilling to admit a mistake. In that environment, you're going to make mistakes. Everyone's going to make mistakes. An unwillingness to admit a mistake will only lead to future bad results, which may not, again, be moral, ethical things, but it may demonstrate sort of a lack of introspection about why you did certain things, what you knew, what could have been reasonably expected. And again, I think it's an indicator in a leader that they're concerned about themselves, not necessarily about us. And so that, I don't know if where that fits in Myers-Briggs or anything else. I would just say, be wary. We want confident people. We want people that are not afraid, to step into the arena, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at some point, a leader without humility is dangerous on this, I think, moral, ethical point of crisis. I think is dangerous.
Okay, thank you. All right, next question, please.
I'm Katie Bauer from the University of Nebraska. And I guess I just want to further the conversation that we had in our small groups. I know Dr. Beading and Colonel Hughes were weighing in on the discussion also. And I guess my question, I think it relates to, I am a business student, and I think it relates to any type of business and military aspect. Obviously, our world is becoming globalized, and even the United States, so many different ethnicities and different backgrounds, and it's really important to learn where other people are coming from. And I guess in the business college at Nebraska, one of our big things is how to communicate with people from different countries, and ethics is a very different thing in the United States, and when you go to China or Japan or any other country that you're doing business with, or that you are involving with the military as well. And so how do you, I guess, communicate or do business with, or in any other, I guess, interaction with people from different countries? How do you, I guess, you don't want to ever, bash or, take a stab at their ethical values, but you don't want to, you want to hold true to your own. So how do you do that, and can you ever bridge that gap? And I would love to hear anybody's point of view on that as well.
Okay, a question of cross-cultural competency. Take it.
I'll tell you something that I think I sort of foresaw. I don't know if it's interesting or not. One of the proudest days I had in Iraq, one of the proudest days, is we had a network building IEDs in a town called Rutba, and we probably had 20 Marines get wounded. Not from our unit, convoys going through. We could not figure this thing out. We finally figured it out. And the guy who was financing this whole thing was about 75 years old, had diabetes, and we did a raid on his house and a raid on a couple other houses there. And this is about 3.5 months into a 7-month deployment. And elderly gentleman. And we got on top of his house. We surrounded it. We got him. He had all kinds of money, a lot of other things. His 2 wives and about 6 daughters were in the house. And as we stood outside, and I Arabic speaker, lived in the Middle East with my family for a year. I'm reasonably well oriented to the culture. The women of that family came out and were crying their eyes out and begging Marines to let their poor old grandfather go. It was a proud moment when Marines went completely stone-faced on him, Because up until that point, that's not how Americans are. Americans see people crying, and we reach out a hand to help them. That's how we are all the time. And our Marines got played in Iraq several times. The message is you got to know yourself. You've got to know the other side as well. Thinking that you're going to do what I do here won't necessarily work, but also know you're never going to be Chinese, Mongolian, Iraqi. You are what you are. You can attempt to understand the other side, to not create some huge faux pas. You can't play that other side, but understanding it is appropriate. And things that completely out of context, if I would have told you that 6 women were crying and a bunch of Marines looked at them and looked the other way, that's terrible. But in the context of that day, those gentlemen had finally learned how to deal with that enemy in a proper way. This is a guy that was responsible for trying to kill us, pure and simple. That was a culture that we were dealing with, very difficult. And I'm not sure those Marines really sort of got it. I think they just had had enough and were changing the way they did business. But as Americans, we are a very friendly, open people, as hard-hearted businessmen as we're supposed to be. Americans love people, we smile, we want to be liked, et cetera, et cetera. Know yourself and know them.
I completely agree, sir. And when I was a missionary in Japan, obviously a very different situation, it took a while to finally come to the place where I began to understand how the Japanese culture operates. So I guess my advice to you would be, number one, make sure you spend some time figuring out sort of the expectations of their society, of their own people, and it is never inappropriate, it is always appropriate to extend respect to them. Even when I was stationed in Japan in the Navy, one of my compatriots, we went out to town and had dinner, and we left this restaurant, and I was bowing and telling the lady that ran the restaurant that the food was good and thank you very much. And my friend refused to do it. She goes, I don't want to talk to her. I'm an American. And that it's that ugly American reputation that unfortunately we have around the planet because of some of the ways that we have treated people who are not Americans. And I would say the first thing, definitely bring respect for them and their culture. If you're in their culture, obviously recognize that you're being hosted by them. It doesn't make it America because we're there, which I think was her attitude. But as well, to very much understand where it is they're coming from. Something so simple as this in American culture is, come here, I need to speak with you, I need to see you, means you're a thief and you're a robber in Japan. So, just even a small gesture. So just to get a basic understanding of who they are, where they're coming from, so you can show respect.
Yeah, from a business context, I've had the great fun and pleasure to work in 3 very large global multinational companies, GE, Citibank, and Fidelity. And the reality today, and it's not news to anyone, is there is no such thing as non-global. All competition, companies, corporations, activities today cross borders. And so there's no avoiding being in that game. The good companies today take advantage of all of the global resources. That means they get out there, they understand the cultures, the customs, the business mores in each of the areas. They hire the local people. I've had the opportunity to build teams in Australia, India, Europe, Middle East, and in all of these cases, everything you've heard about understanding the culture, being sensitive to it, understanding it's different from ours, not right or wrong, it's just different from ours, you have to take into account. But then bringing that back to the ethics line, then there's a line that you come up to. So you get to the question in business of, well, gee, bribes and things are okay and a normal part of business in certain parts of the world. Your company that you work for, has to have a culture and a mission, a value statement around that. And you can make your personal choice about whether or not that fits yours. In some parts of the world, there's active discrimination that would appall us as Americans in how they treat certain nationalities, countries, or cultures that happen to live within their borders. It's outright, it's open, it's absolutely appalling to me as an American when I saw it. Personal reaction. From a business point of view, your company has to draw some lines, decide where it stands, and frankly, I would say that many of the companies that have gotten in trouble around the world, including a large German industrial company, drew no lines, and you heard about it earlier in the conference, I believe, drew no lines, made no statements, had no values as a company, and therefore the people in that organization didn't know what was expected to them. And it wasn't surprising you got bad results. But it's a reality. You're all going to be in a much more interesting, exciting, complex world than I certainly have faced in my last 35 years. And the encouraging thing is I know you're all much more prepared than I was to go do that.
Okay, thanks. I'm actually going to stay on this side. You've been patiently waiting there for quite some time, so please.
Good afternoon. My name is Shauna Sinnott. I'm from Harvard University, where I'm a Marine Corps midshipman in the ROTC program. So my question is more military-oriented. If you're in a situation where you're leading a group, but you have leaders above you. And I'm interested to hear any of your opinions on how you reconcile when your leaders' values and priorities conflict with your own, where there aren't really legal lines. It's not like you're trying to contradict orders, but where what they think is important conflicts with what you think is important in order to complete the mission for the unit.
Okay, a question of loyalty versus honor and attention. Colonel Constantini, I think you started with some of that. So
Yeah,
throw it to you.
and I think this is really important. Because the question is, by doing what the boss tells you to do, are you going to cross a moral, ethical limit? The simple answer is no, I'm not going to, pure and simple. I'm not going to steal, I'm not going to do those things. I don't think you run into a lot of that. I think where you run into in the combat environment is the degree of risk. You lay your hand on that Marine. You see him, you know their family, you look them in the eye, you know them, you love them, you care for them. You understand the risk. Your boss at one level up is slightly less involved, you could say. The discussion that has to happen is you have to tell the CO, whether it's your company commander, battalion commander, regimental commander, you know, all the way up, your perception of the battlefield and what you think the risk is that you're taking. Because that person has got to make decisions way above your pay grade as well. And they may not understand the risk, so they have an improper calculus, or by you informing them, they may completely understand the risk and tell you to go do it anyhow. That's, as long as you're not crossing a moral, ethical boundary, I personally don't have a problem with that. Now, does that mean that your unit is going to pay a cost? Yeah, for sure. But I think there's countless military examples where certain units were tasked to do certain things and suffered horrendous casualties that led to the overall good accomplishment of a mission. It's not for you to say no. Again, as long as we don't cross a moral, ethical, legal sort of boundary. The fact that your unit is in the breach. Good example from a movie, Memphis Belle. I don't know if you remember the story. They're flying their 25th mission. They're getting ready to go home. They fly over the city. It's blanketed, so they don't drop their bombs. So they got to go around. They could have flown home. And the pilot says, no, we can't fly home. We got to go drop the bombs. Because if we don't do it, someone else is going to have to do it. You know, that's what it is. It's someone's got to do this mission. If there's a legal, moral, ethical thing, then I think you need to stand up and be counted. And that may mean that you're no longer the platoon commander, company commander, et cetera, et cetera. But again, It's not about you. It's just not. So develop a relationship with the boss. Make sure that you can have those conversations. Make sure that they understand the risk. And then within the limit, do what you're told. That's how the organization works.
I think one of the topics that Admiral Houck talked about this afternoon was this willingness to dissent within an organization. That is an environment that has to be created by the leadership. If someone dissents against your view as the leader and you shut them down or humiliate them in public, then it's unlikely that you're ever going to get a meaningful critical comment again. So it's a difficult and challenging environment to encourage as a leader, because even in the absence of that, there's going to be an automatic reluctance to do so. So that's kind of the first part about you being able to go to your boss and say, ma'am, sir, I think that's a bad decision, and why. You got to have your reasons why, thought out deliberately and logically and rationally as to why you think that's a bad decision and why another course of action might be better. If in fact your superior says, okay, great, thank you for your input in your interest in national defense, this is what we're going to do. What I will say is that from my personal experience, you'll have a sense for the person you're working for and how they make decisions. And if it's somebody, unless you really, really distrust them, my suggestion is go with it, because almost every instance they have the advantage of information and experience that you don't have, just from your position in the organization. And what I have found is that when I had fairly strong disagreement with a course of action, but went ahead and did it, looking back 6-8 months later, it was the right course of action. And what I came to learn was that it was because, just by their position and the fact that they've been around maybe a few years longer, they had more experience and knowledge that I didn't have the advantage of. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you,
Okay.
gentlemen.
Okay, thank you. All right, this side.
This question is directed at Colonel Constantini. I saw in your bio, sir, that you were a FAO in Egypt, and I was hoping you could speak to some of the ethical dilemmas that you may have come across as a political military official, and with the increasing nature of our militaries working with other, countries' militaries, what we might have to expect in the realm of ethical dilemmas militarily.
The foreign area officer training, I lived in Egypt for a year. It was actually a year of training. I didn't have a mission when I was there. Went to graduate school for a year, went to language school for a year and a half, and then I went there for a year. It was sort of a 3.5-year training, where I ran into political, military type issues, 2 places. One is a battalion commander in Iraq. It was not a full-on combat mission. We did a lot of support and stability type operations where we were rebuilding the Iraqi economy, et cetera. And I'll tell you the dilemmas I had when I was there is we poured a ton of money into that place, a frightful amount of money. And it wasn't clear to me that we were getting value for our money. Part of the mission was to just spend money, though. Get money into that economy and going. And it bothered me, I think, as a taxpayer more than anything, what we were spending there and what I thought we were getting out of it. And it's funny because the Marine Corps just ended our involvement in Iraq as an organized force, I think this week. And the Sergeant Major there sent a very nice email out thanking all the Marines who had served there. And I reflected on that a lot, in that when I was there in 2004, it sure wasn't obvious that we were going to get to the end. And so maybe that some of the things that I thought were ethical, I was wrong. You know, in the end, we were successful. And so I commend what the doctor just had to say is, you know, if it's not a clear moral ethical dilemma and the boss tells you to do something, that's how this organization works. You do what the boss says, and hopefully that's a smart person. And in the end, whoever the boss was, I'm still not sure. Sort of had it figured out in Iraq. We got to the right end. On the other side, I spent a year and a half on a joint staff, and I traveled with a lieutenant general whose primary duty was was a military advisor to the Secretary of State. And the military in the United States is involved in things that there's no military involved in anywhere else in the world. The fact that a Marine Corps colonel is riding around in Condoleezza Rice's airplane, you know, backstopping a 3-star general as she travels around on diplomatic missions. No one else does that. The thing I'll tell you, though, is that I don't think there's any spies here. Of all the people in that entourage, the person, other than Dr. Rice, because I can't say that I know her, the 3-star general I worked for had a better sense of decisions, consequences, appropriate behavior, conduct, a sense of the nation, I'll say, than any other person in the Secretary's entourage. The military has trained us to be in charge, to be accountable, and to be transparent. That is not necessarily how the rest of our government always works. There was no political discussion with the general. There was right, there was wrong, there's what's best for the country. And so I think that we have very good preparation for that, and I hopefully that he taught some of the people through his own example what appropriate conduct was. So,
Great, thanks. Back to this side.
Midshipman Robert Dunn, First Class, Merchant Marine Academy. My question is directed towards the whole panel. At what point, in order to preserve the honor and the integrity of an organization, do you close the school of second chances for people who have made ethical violations?
Okay, what's the tolerance for mistakes here? Who would like to jump on that one first? Anyone? Okay, Jeff.
That's probably one of the more difficult decisions that a leader has to make, because part of us is driven towards accomplishing the mission that we've signed up to and hopefully you believe passionately in, and you want to see it happen. And so you know you have an accountability and responsibility to that. And the other half of you wants to develop and grow your people, your team, and your next set of leaders. So you will have to make judgment calls as you go along, and I've found no easy answer there except a couple of guidelines. There are certain ethical and moral standards that, if violated, are so egregious, you have to decide whether you even allow a second chance. And that's a function of an organization, a culture. If you're in a service, it's fairly clear. We define those things very clearly in a service. In the civilian world, it's not clear at all what is considered egregious in terms of crossing that boundary. But you got to have some tripwires there that say that there are no second chances. For those things that there are second chances, then what you have to do is assess whether the person really understands they've made a mistake, really cares whether they made a mistake. Do they have it in their heart to correct it? Now, are they trying hard? And are they getting there? You can give a little more rope for that, second chance, maybe a third chance. But at some point, you got to go back to part one, which is you have a mission, you have an organization, you have a team, and if you've done all you can do to develop and the person's been given a fair chance to recover from it and still doesn't, then you have to make an even tougher call.
Very similar, I think, to your comments is there's 3 factors. And I'm not a fan of situational ethics or the ends justify the means. But the 3 variables that you need to look at in each situation is the situation. How critical was it, and what was the act? What was the nature of the breach of moral decision making? You know, did you ask them a question and they panicked and gave you a lie because they were afraid of the consequences, but then subsequently their response was, I'm sorry, I lied to you, that was incorrect, I did give the medication to the patient, or whatever the situation might be. So you have the severity of the situation, the individual's response, and finally their track record. I mean, if this is a person who's been kind of on the edge in other areas, they're probably not worth much more of an investment. You know, maybe their work ethic is a little bit weak, their other professional values may be questionable, then I wouldn't give them as much of a chance. But if you've got somebody who really has shown a good overall character and has a mistake, then that's a person I give the second chance to.
I would just ask one question, and who benefits? You know, stealing is stealing. If you steal so that you can pad your bank account, that's one thing. If you steal so that your unit has fuel to move forward, that's another thing. It doesn't make it right, but who benefits? Some of those people you can mentor. Some of those people you probably can't mentor. Who benefits?
Okay. And back to this side.
Good afternoon. First Class Duffy, I'm here with the Senior Capstone Seminar for Officership, and thank you for allowing us to come today. This morning, we were discussing the importance of understanding the situation and peeling back the layers, if you will, before making a decision. As you all discussed, making a decision in a crisis, which I would define as having very little or maybe no information at all, how do you balance taking the time to find out as much as you can between pulling the trigger, if you will, and actually making a decision? Thank you.
Interesting question. Anybody like to take that one? First on that one? Jeff again? Okay, great.
I'll share a little story that I think fits that scenario, and my answer, not surprising, is going to be there's no pat answer to that, but I had taken over an organization in GE, very large organization, been losing a lot of money for many years. I was part of a management team. We were told that we had 1 year to turn the organization around, or we're going to shut it down, and 6,000 people were going to lose their jobs, and that was just the economics of that business. I inherited a new team. Clock was ticking. I had 12 months, and I knew within 30 days I had to make calls about my management team. And there's no way in my experience that you can be sure about people and give them chances and test them and see what they're made of in 30 days. But nevertheless, I had to make calls at the end of the 30 days, which resulted in some people losing their jobs and rebuilding of that team. It was a very difficult call. I still don't know to this day whether the people I had to let go would have cut it in the end, but I had to go with that. I think someone mentioned it the other day. It's back here in the back of your brainstem. It's your experience. It's the decisions you've made all through your life, and you have to go with the gut reaction, taking in as much data as you can, but there comes a point when you have to make a decision. And that's just business. I wouldn't begin to compare it with the decision process that people like the colonel have to go through on a battlefield.
Obviously, there's not a 6.8 second time frame for that. The time for that is prior to the situation being developed. And what I mean by that is it's the leadership that establishes the environment. Is especially when you use the metaphor pull the trigger, which obviously we can mean making a purchase or any other action. But in our business, pulling the trigger is really what we do sometimes. And the two situations that come to my mind where a critical decision was made that had very tragic consequences, one is when the Air Force shot down a Black Hawk helicopter over northern Iraq during Northern Watch. And the other one was when the U.S. Navy shot down an Iranian airliner coming off the deck. In both of those situations, there was an environment created prior to the incident that allowed for lack of discipline and over-emotionalization of what the task at hand was. And because of that environment, poor decisions were made in very short periods of time that resulted in those tragedies. So it's the leadership's job to make sure that people don't take don't take their responsibilities lightly, regardless of what the environment is, and make sure that they understand the seriousness of the consequences of their actions, and that over celebration sometimes, you're not scoring a touchdown or stopping a touchdown. This isn't a football game, and we've got to take our job as deadly serious as it really is.
And this, in the micro tactical environment, can be a very painful thing to discuss. In that, I told Marines in terms of rules of engagement, if you can tell me what you did right away, you almost always did the right thing. If you really got to think about how you're going to explain to me what you did, you probably didn't do the right thing. And very often, Marines can follow all the rules and do the wrong thing. I owned about 300 kilometers of highway and guardrails down the center line, 3 lanes on each side. And we found that insurgents are molding IEDs and putting them in the guardrails. So we took down all the guardrails, and we made it known throughout the community, do not be on the center of that highway at night, or we're going to shoot you. And we got that cleared as a legitimate rule of engagement through. We advertised it, et cetera, et cetera. And probably about 2 weeks later, one of my crews shot a guy. And when we came up on it, Iraqis used to strip the steel out of the guardrails to help basically build their houses. This guy was not planting IEDs. He was someone that didn't need to be shot. So what's the dilemma? The dilemma is, what's the thought process of that crew when they're going through and actually squeezing that trigger? Is their thought process, I don't have time, I've got to do this now? If that's the thought process, then it's probably legitimate under the rule of engagement. If that's not the thought process, what is the thought process? And then you get into the really dark side of human emotion. And I'll tell you, there's people out there that like to shoot people. How you deal with that when it's maybe even following the rules is difficult, very difficult. Because now it's also a moral dilemma for you. How am I going to address this? If I investigate it, am I being loyal to my Marines? I think there's a good case in the media right now going on. I used to think about this, though, is that I investigate all these things. That's the only way to be loyal to my Marines. Because guys that did wrong, they need to go to jail. And the guys that did right don't need to have that stain on their honor. We will keep our honor clean. The guys that did right, in the end, they don't mind being investigated. The first time they do, because no one likes to talk to lawyers. But after the first time, they know, if I did the right thing, that's what's going to get advertised, and it's important. But I'll tell you, there is a dilemma for the leader. Where is my loyalty? What is the perception of it? Oh, and I've got to tell my boss that I think maybe we did the wrong thing. Now I've got to put myself, it can get very complicated after a microsecond of thought, squeezing the trigger.
Okay. Chaplain, do you have anything? Okay. We have possibly time for 2 more questions at this rate. So not to cut off the rest, but I'd hate to see you stand there for nothing. And we are bumped up against a 3:30 or 15:30 photo op. So we may have a little bit of time to address questions individually at the front here. Please.
Good afternoon. Midshipman Second Class Ding Lawson from UCLA. And this question is directed toward the entire panel. I just wanted to know the entire panel's opinion on this. Ever since the attacks of September 11th, we've implemented measures in the name of national security. I'm kind of moving away from an individual level. And often these measures have been criticized because they've been highly controversial. For example, the shipment of prisoners to Guantanamo Bay, and now with a more recent example, there's been talk about putting highly intrusive body scanners ever since the attempted attack this past Christmas Day. So I wanted to know the panel's opinion on where we draw the line in terms of national security and our values as Americans. Not to go too far back in history, but I just took a Roman history class, and a lot of prominent figures took extreme measures in the name of national security to the point where the Roman Republic fell and the Roman Empire was erected. So if the panel could explain their opinion on that, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Okay. A question of national security versus civil liberties. Anybody like to take that one on?
I'm going to talk here as a private citizen. I think we need to think through this a little bit, and what is our constitutional rights and how we feel as society, et cetera, et cetera. Personally, I say a little prayer to myself every time I go through an airport scanner. It goes something like, I cannot wait to win the war on terror so I don't have to disrobe in an airport ever again. All right? I'm a libertarian as far as I can be. On the other hand, you don't have a God-given right to fly in an airplane. And so you have to put up with certain things. I also think that sometimes the theory and the practice are dramatically different. Was the government listening in on our telephone calls? You know, you all seen the Simpsons movie? You seen it? Remember the guy in the desk at the NSA? We found one, we found one. I don't think there's a million people at the NSA listening to telephones trying to check up on us. So the idea that the government was wiretapping our phones, I have a hard time believing that. The fact that you don't necessarily have a constitutional right to talk to terrorist organizations in Algiers from telephones in the UK that happen to route through a router in New York City. I just don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with people willing to give up freedom to obtain security, because in the end you get neither. And hopefully we're the first line of that defense. You may get put in a position where you've got to enforce some of these things. I think there's sailors down at Guantanamo Bay guarding, I don't know if we call them prisoners. I think prisoners is a word legally. Yeah, they're detainees. I may take exception with the Admiral that I don't think that they have all the rights under the Geneva Convention. You get on the ground somewhere, you're going to handle people. You have to do the right thing, because in the end you want to keep your honor clean. But I also think that we should back away from the front page of the New York Times and whatever news organization that are blasting how this is the end of society as we know it, because someone is going to scan to make sure we don't have whatever crammed wherever when we get on the plane. So.
I would probably be one of the first people to complain, like the Colonel, at some of those things, but at one time in my life, I was an immigration inspector at the Peace Arch border crossing in Canada, and there we were obviously inspecting cars that would come through, and it's amazing. I think it's a very North American phenomenon. We are very much entitlement-minded. We believe we have the right to a lot of what we honestly don't have rights to. If I have to get to LA, I don't have to fly, like he was saying. I can drive. I think the government is spending its time and its energy trying to make sure that we're protected. Do they go way over and above and beyond what they need to? I don't know. I'm not at the pay grade to make those decisions. But I do know that they're doing what they can do to make sure that they can provide safety for us. And if it's inconvenient for me, then I'm the one that has to deal with my own emotions about it. If they decide to camp out in my living room, and monitor what I watch on television, then I think, well, okay, yeah, personal rights are being violated here. I definitely have a right to my own, my own living room without the government sitting in there. And I don't think we're even close to that in America, especially, with how the Soviet bloc used to be, and the infringement upon rights there. I think we have a long way to go before the government is doing to us what my personal opinion would be infringing upon my rights. For me, it's making sure I keep a check on, am I just being entitlement-minded here, thinking I have the right to, or is this really an infringement? So.
Okay, thanks. And final question, I'll have to ask the panelists for this final question to keep their responses brief. Again, we have a group photo to be taken soon.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Midshipman Second Class Daniel Woods from Maine Maritime Academy. A lot of this, I think, has been discussed in the prior discussion, but I was hoping that some of you could touch upon some of the methodology and precautions of evaluating your subordinates ethically in time of a dilemma or a crisis.
Okay. How do you assess morality? Question. Anybody like to jump on that one? Bueller? Anyone? It's a tough one.
Make a couple of brief comments about that. I would say that you're unlikely to be able to do much of an assessment during a critical dilemma in the short term. Certainly, the retrospectoscope can be, very invasive and maybe give you some insight. But what you need to do before you get into that dilemma, again, and I keep saying the time is before the critical time comes, you need to be paying attention to your subordinates all along, seeing how they handle the day-to-day issues. Because as has been mentioned several times, you're going to react in a crisis like you do normally. You don't throw the switch, as Colonel Constantini said, and become, okay, I'm going to do things right. Now, if you cut corners and put your integrity into question during your normal actions, you're certainly not going to all of a sudden become moral with high integrity when your butt's on the line. So watch them day to day.
Just briefly, I'd say as a leader and as part of an organization, you have the responsibility to carry out the values and the ethics of the organization you signed up for. And within your purview as a leader, you're within your right to say, this is my expectations around your job responsibilities and the kind of culture and values that I want as a leader of an organization. As long as those are legal under the law, then it is fair for you to evaluate and judge the performance of your organization and individuals.
I'll give you one thing. I think the hardest part that some leaders have is that to have this discussion with their subordinates, perhaps when their subordinates are straying, is difficult. It's very difficult to look people in the eye and challenge them on things like this. If you're unwilling to do that, it's probably because of you. You're worried a little bit about yourself. We have a significant legal case in Haditha where some Iraqis got shot and a bunch of different people were involved. And it's not necessarily clear that the leadership looked into the eyes of their subordinates and really questioned what they did. And some of the excuses are, well, I didn't want them to think I was second-guessing them. Well, you don't have that luxury. You're in charge. You're responsible. You have to ask hard questions. People have to give you legitimate answers. If you're willing to ask hard questions, then people should respect, and they will respect it. If you're not willing to ask hard questions, you'll get run over, and you'll have subordinates doing the wrong thing.
All right, I'd like to first start off by thanking all of you for your attention. In particular, thank you for the great questions, insightful questions. That's been the theme throughout the conference so far. And if you would, please join me in a round of applause for our panelists here this afternoon.